When we think of the Franks, two things immediately spring to mind. One, Charlemagne, the greatest ruler of the Middle Ages, and two, the fact that the Franks lended their name to France. So those two things will come up, just not right now. Actually, it won't happen this week at all. We're going to talk about the conditions leading up to Charlemagne, but we'll save our discussion of that famous ruler for a different time. So we see here the light brown, which looks like a form of stool, is the kingdom that Charlemagne inherited in 768. So we're going to talk about how the Franks went from being just one minor group on the east side of the Rhine to controlling all of that land. The gentleman, or the depiction of a gentleman in gold, is Charlemagne himself, but again, we won't meet him quite yet. The city pictured is Tournai. This was the original capital of the Franks. Unfortunately, we can't get any contemporary photos of it, so this is kind of what the city looks like now. Most of the ruins there would be much later from the Middle Ages, so not quite contemporary with any of the Franks. And that is Deep Space Nine. I'll explain that as time goes on. Just so you know, Deep Space Nine was not literally involved in Frankish history. Let's behave as logical people and begin at the beginning. So how did the Franks get into the Roman Empire? Well, they were already settled on the border prior to the Great Invasion of 406, and they were settled up in basically what is the Netherlands and Belgium, more or less. And as the Roman Empire continued to collapse, the Franks would expand their power to the west into what is now northern France. Eventually, by about 440 or so, they were able to take the city of Tournai, and that was their capital for a good number of years. Now, also, the Franks, unlike most of the other people we studied who had converted to Arian Christianity, were predominantly pagan at this time. If you look at the map, they were in an area which didn't have a ton of cities compared to the rest of Roman Europe. And as we've discussed, Christianity was primarily an urban religion, so there would really have been no reason for the Franks to have converted if you look at it from a sociological perspective. Now, another thing to note is that there are multiple groups of Franks. This map is not in English, but if you look closely, you can see that there are the Francs Saliens and the Francs Renan. These are two different groups of Franks. The group called the Francs Saliens, they are also called the Salians, and because in early sources they're just referred to simply as the Salians rather than the Salian Franks, there's a pretty good possibility that they were originally non-Frankish at all, and that later on they took up the identity of Franks when they took up the ambition of uniting all of their neighbors who happened to be Franks, and they had been around them so long that they had become a lot like them anyway. But, I don't know, it's kind of based on a little bit of speculation and some incomplete evidence. It doesn't really matter too much, I suppose. While we're talking about things based on speculation that aren't super impactful, let's talk about the supposed origins of the Frankish royal family. The first royal family was called the Merovingian dynasty, and they traced themselves back to a founder called Merovec, who supposedly lived from 415 to 457. He was the ruler of the early Salian Franks. Now, the thing is, we have no actual confirmation of his life. We have no artifacts or anything else which confirms that he was actually a person who lived, or that he was blood kin to Clovis. So, it's possible he lived. There's not really a great reason why the Franks would randomly make this guy up, especially since he doesn't really do anything super impressive, so he's probably real. But, anyway, so his career, supposedly that he was an ally of Aetius against Attila, so he would have fought at the Catilinarian fields towards the end of his life. And there also is a modern conspiracy theory promoted by the book Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and carried on by Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, that Merovic and his descendants carried the blood of Jesus, and that Jesus had secret descendants who had moved to France, and then when the Franks moved in, they had intermarried into the Merovingian dynasty somehow. That's obviously not true. If you ever run across that anywhere, it's something that some guy made up in the 80s based on literally no evidence. The first ruler who we can definitely confirm as being historical is Childeric I. He came to power in 457 at the age of 18, and he eventually died in 481. At some point during his reign, he was exiled for 8 years, supposedly for immorality of some kind, probably sexual, but we don't really know. He is the guy who established the capital at Tournai. Also, just like Merovic, assuming that Merovic was real, he was an ally with the local Romans. There was a local Roman ruler called Aegidius in northern Gaul, and they became allies to fight against the Visigoths. Ultimately, that pressure that the combined force of Childeric and Aegidius exerted was what contained the Visigoths in Gaul and made them start really focusing more on their Spanish possessions. He has a daughter named Audifleda. She married Childeric the Great. And of course, Childeric's primary claim to fame is that he's the daddy of Clovis I, the, one true ruler of the Franks. And this is a signet ring of Clovis. This is a pretty awesome find. So this is the thing he would have used to seal his documents while he was king. Clovis came to power in 481 at just 15 years old. It wasn't all that uncommon back then, and he was basically a man by the standards of his day, even if he was an extremely inexperienced one. However, it didn't take him long to get his legs under him. He managed to conquer the Roman survival state, the Kingdom of Soissons, also called the Dominion of Syagrius. It has a few different names. He conquers this in 486. This was an area under the control of Syagrius, who was the son of Aegidius. I'll probably eventually make a video on that, but it might be a while. After that great victory, Clovis went on to unite all of the Franks, so this is the first time we can speak of a Frankish kingdom and not just a Salian Frankish kingdom. He also managed to subdue the Alemanni, who are a Germanic tribe further inland, sort of more in the Eastern Netherlands, Western Germany area. So he launched a bloody and brutal campaign in that direction and won a very hard-fought battle. During that battle, Clovis had prayed to the Christian God and asked for assistance, and he had won the battle. So after a couple years of hard thinking he decided to convert. And unlike almost all other barbarian kings, he decided to convert to Catholicism, or I guess maybe the more correct term at that time would be Orthodox Christianity, since there hadn't been a separation of the Catholic and Orthodox churches yet. So he does that, and that begins a pattern where most of the Franks will start converting, and within a generation or two, pretty much all of them will be Catholic. He makes Paris his new capital, so no more Tournai. Now we're in a city you've actually heard of. And Paris will remain more or less the capital of the Franks forever until, actually Charlemagne, but we won't get to that today. And he also is the ruler who officially annexed the majority of what the Visigoths held in Gaul. So remember, in a previous video I talked about how the Visigoths held an area called Aquitaine, and they had started out there, and that was actually the basis of their kingdom. Well, Clovis takes all that in 507, in the same campaign that created the Visigothic succession crisis, which I also talked about in 2 previous videos on the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths. One thing that greatly held back the success of the Franks, both before and after Charlemagne, is the insistence of various rulers on observing Germanic inheritance laws rather than taking up the Roman model of allowing a father to distribute his property however he saw fit. So when Clovis died, he had conquered a great deal of land. You see here everything that's highlighted in a color that's not white was something Clovis had. And then he has to divide it among his sons. Well, that didn't go super well. So he has 4 sons. And they're dividing the majority of Western France plus the Netherlands and Belgium. And now so you got 4 kingdoms, and they all want to be the main guy. So, but they also don't want to fight their brothers, and they don't want to fight a Frankish civil war. So instead, they turn to the kingdom of the Burgundians and launch an invasion. I have details of that war on my video about the Burgundians. So after 10 years, they conquer Burgundia, and now they have extra land, but that doesn't solve the real problem. So they have to get back to fighting each other for the crowns their father had held. And eventually, one of the sons, Chlothar I, is able to do that by the year 558 when he's already in his 60s. And then, shockingly, as only rarely happens with old people, he died in a few years. So he only had the Frankish kingdom reunited for 3 years, then he dies, and he has 4 sons, and apparently he didn't learn anything from the previous experience, so he also divided it among these 4 sons. And the process started over. Since this process of division, reunification, partial reunification, then the death of the ruler and another subdivision happened so many times, I'm not going to go into detail on any of the subsequent divisions of the Frankish kingdom. There are several of them. I'm just going to show you 2 maps. The one on the left is from 561 with the death of Chlothar I, and then there was another division in 587 under some different Merovingian kings. The details really don't matter. You see the general pattern, and you can appreciate what's going on here. By a combination of mass murder and luck, and being at the right place at the right time, and not being too old to exploit it, Chlothar II, called either the Young or the Great, was able to reunite all of the Franks under one kingdom in 613, and then he ruled until 628. The main thing that people point out about him, and I assume a lot of it has to do with the sources being heavily Christian, is that he was a monogamist. He only had one wife. And that might seem like a pretty mundane thing. Most rulers only have one wife. However, the Franks actually were pretty dedicated polygamists, especially the Merovingian dynasty. Maybe not the common Frank, but certainly the Merovingians. Almost all of them had many wives, until Chlothar II changed all that. Now, he had an opportunity to put his dynasty back on the right footing and reestablish their power, but he really didn't make the changes that he needed to ensure that his dynasty would be stable and that it would hold the chief position in the state. So he allows power to continue to seep away from the monarchs towards the aristocrats, the local aristocrats, and also the bishops, who, of course, came from aristocratic families. He also made what ended up being a fatal mistake for his descendants when he took the powerful office of the mayor of the palace, which was basically the equivalent of like the Magister Officiorum, so he's sort of the head of the bureaucracy, and he makes that office inherited. And in 617, there was a family called the Carolingians who held that office. We'll see them again. In 614, he also does similar things to what he does with the mayor of the palace. He issues an edict, also known as the Edict of Paris, which further empowered nobles in decision-making and in the succession of kings. It gave them more rights to land. It basically sort of helped set up a proto-version of feudalism. We'll talk more about feudalism later on in the course. And it also makes the very odd step of giving the church in France a monopoly on literacy. So the only way that you can achieve literacy now is to go to an ecclesiastical school like a monastery and learn how to read from churchmen. And I assume that, I don't want to get too much into it yet since I have a whole slide about it, but I guess you could say that you could make an argument for this being a Dark Age just because these very small accomplishments were enough to earn him the nickname the Great. I mean, normally you have to do something of note, but this guy basically stumbled into a unified government and allowed his power to continue to be undermined by the people around him. So, if that's great, then, hey, I could be the king of the Franks, and I could do a great job too. One thing that really undermined the Merovingian kings as much as their ambitious advisors and the bad idea of allowing German inheritance laws to remain in place is the fact that most Merovingian princes did not live very long. It just wasn't all that healthy of a bloodline. So Chlothar didn't really live all that long. He dies, and then his son is able to rule a united Frankish kingdom, but then he drops dead after 5 years or so, and the process of division and regional warfare began anew. Finally, after about 40 or so years of complete division, one king named Childeric III manages to reunite all of the Frankish kingdom. And part of his deal is that he strikes a bargain with the mayor of Austrasia. So the mayor of the palace there is the guy actually doing the negotiation with one of the kings from one of the other areas like Neustria. So this further empowers the mayor of the palace, and especially the mayors who come from Austrasia, who, surprise, surprise, are the Carolingians, the Carolingian family. By the time we get to Theoderic's son, he has a child son, and partly because he doesn't come of age, and partly just because the power dynamics had changed so much, Clovis IV is the first king who's a complete and total puppet, who, so far as we can tell, makes literally no decisions and has no meaningful power. There's also his younger brother, Childeric III, who grew up, and he earned the nickname the Just, but he never actually left his estate. We know that he held some power and that he presided over court cases, but if he never left his estate, that means that his advisors could tell him what to do, and then they could praise him for giving in to what they wanted when they wrote the official report, which makes him just. And they also got to control what court cases he would hear, since they could admit or reject people trying to come to his court. And that's one of the problems with palace princes, is that they effectively don't know what's going on in the world around them. But he got a pretty cool nickname out of the whole thing, so I guess he can't be that upset. He also probably only lived to be about 30 or so, so, I guess that's pretty good if you can earn a nickname for justice by the time you're 30. Not too bad. One of the major consequences of having weaker Merovingian kings who didn't lead armies and didn't leave their palace is that local aristocrats became much more powerful and independent. The most important and interesting of the aristocrats of this period is the Duke of Aquitaine named Odo the Great. Now, we know that he was in power before 700, but we're not sure exactly when. We certainly know he was well entrenched by 700, and he lived a long time, all the way up until his death of old age in 735. Now, because the Merovingian state had grown so weak, Odo was more or less able to do whatever he wanted, and he was a power play politician of the highest order. So he was on the border region between the Visigoths and the Franks, and he was active in both of their politics, looking for advantages and ways to enhance his own territory as much as possible. So the thing is, though, his whole plan of possibly making a kingdom of Aquitaine is kind of what we assume he was trying to do. We don't know for sure. Kind of fell apart because in 711, as we mentioned in our Visigoth video, there was an invasion of Spain by the Arabs. What I didn't get to, and what I won't fully get to until a couple weeks from now, is that the whole Visigothic kingdom collapsed. And it was completely overrun, and now we have the troops of the Umayyad Caliphate raiding into France. Well, who's on the border? It's Odo. And that is why I had the Deep Space Nine joke, because in Deep Space Nine, it's a Star Trek series where there's a space station, and one of the characters on it is named Odo, and it's tasked with guarding a wormhole which leads to a great empire called the Dominion. But anyway, back to the Franks. So Odo is faced with a fairly tough dilemma. He has the Franks on one side looking to punish him as they're regrouping, and their current mayor of the palace, Charles Martel, is angry with them. And on the other hand, he has the Umayyads who are still looking to expand. So he has to deal with that, and it proves to be quite a lot to handle. But he does a pretty good job. In 721, he wins a battle at Toulouse when he's attacked by a large Umayyad force, and that's actually the first victory of any Western European against the Arab invasions. He kills thousands of enemy soldiers, and the reason why he was able to win is because the general in charge on the other side didn't take the proper precautions, so Odo was able to attack him while his troops were unprepared, inflict thousands of casualties. And this made Odo a great hero, and that's where he earned the name the Great, which I think he was more entitled to than, what's his face, Chlothar the Great. Anyway, so he got praised by the Pope, and his stock was really high, but then he kind of ruined it for himself when he tried, understandably, to hold off from further Muslim attacks by marrying one of his daughters to a rebel lord who was breaking away from the Umayyad Caliphate. Well, that guy didn't get that far, and also the Franks were angry, so it ended up backfiring, but it actually wasn't a dumb idea. Later on in 732, Odo is forced to run away from the Umayyads. They came with too many men for him to fight, so he actually had to go with his tail between his legs and ask Charles for help. And then the two men fought together as allies at the Battle of Tours, a very famous battle in 732, and they were the victors. This is another one of these battles where, the Franks were able to actually defeat the Arab invaders. The thing is, we'll talk about Tours a little bit later. It's not all that important for the most part. The Muslim sources make it out to be more of a skirmish, and it did not deter them from further attacks. They continued to attack southern France. But for the Franks, this was a pivotal moment in their history because it gave them a sense of purpose. And for Charles Martel and his family, the Carolingians, it also made them feel like they were the legitimate power, not just the real power, but the legitimate power, and that God had favored them by granting them this great victory over the Muslims, whereas the Merovingian kings were sitting around in their palaces, playing the flute or whatever they did. So, yeah, Odo. He put aside his prejudice for solids long enough to defend Toulouse. I guess that's pretty good. So just now I mentioned that Charles Martel was the mayor of the palace and that his shining moment was the Battle of Tours. But that then raises the question, well, how did the Carolingians get to this position in the first place? Well, if we rewind just a bit, we remember that they were the family holding the office of mayor of the palace in 617 when it became hereditary. Had that office become hereditary at a slightly different date, then we don't know what the history of the Carolingian house would have looked like, but it probably would have been a great deal different. Slowly after this happens, they're able to gradually increase their control over various Merovingian kings. There are probably Carolingian officers in all of these little different sub-kingdoms when, the sons would divide these kingdoms amongst themselves. So the three major figures who emerge from this are Pepin of Herschel, who is Charles's father, and he was also a great general at a time when, the Merovingian kings weren't really leading anything. And so he actually won an additional title in addition to mayor of the palace. He won the title of Duke and Prince of the Franks, which made him sound like a royal of sorts. So this really is a major step forward because it sort of begins to legitimate the idea that there's something about the Carolingian family that's regal and kingly. Obviously, Charles Martel, we've already talked about his Battle of Tours. His statue is on the left there. He's still a great hero in French history to this day. He also had equally, if not more important work in centralizing the government. So that was something which really increased the power of the state and would enable the Franks to field larger, stronger, better supplied armies and to engage in larger scale building. And he also fought in many other wars. The Battle of Tours was just one battle he fought in one campaign. So he actually had a much broader career beyond that. And then Charles' son was called Pepin the Short. He was also a mayor for 10 years. And eventually, though, he became really good friends with the Pope. And the two of them agreed that it was time for a change. So he told the last Merovingian king to pack his stuff and head to a monastery. Then he took the throne from 751 to 768. In 768, of course, he dies and he has a son also named Charles, but then he became known as Charles the Great. Great in Latin is Magnus. The two words Charles and Magnus were smushed together over time. Charlemagne. So let's go into a few fun facts about the Frankish culture, and we can also talk about the Frankish state as we continue to explore this idea of whether or not the Franks were in a dark age. Now, the Merovingians tended to practice polygamy for many years after Clovis's conversion. I assume that Chlothar II was the last, the first to practice monogamy, and after him, his successors followed suit. But I don't know for certain. It is possible that they kept it up even after that. Actually, I'm pretty sure Charlemagne had more than one wife, but I haven't been looking stuff up on Charlemagne, so let's just call that a shot in the dark. Do not quote me on that at any point. We also know there's a custom among the Franks where they actually don't name babies at first, and they delay baptism until the child's a little older. And that actually ended up having a historical impact, because then royal babies could be hidden, and if they didn't have a name yet, you wouldn't know, like, oh, that baby has a name that corresponds with a king name. So this is how Chlothar II, as a baby, was able to be smuggled out of a palace during the middle of the Civil War, and how he eventually achieved adulthood and unified France. They also imitated Byzantine coinage. I didn't really provide too many examples. We've seen enough of them. They all look the same. They just have different names on them and slightly different face styles. But unless you have a trained eye, it wouldn't be all that useful. Peasants are semi-indentured. Now, it's not full-blown serfdom where they're completely tied to the land and they're sold like property, but it's getting there. And over time, as the Frankish kings continue to approve of more and more noble power, this becomes more and more the case. And one of the socioeconomic pressures, there we go, I wanted to say it right, socioeconomic pressures, which forces, or at least encourages, feudalism to form, is that there's a pretty big drop in trade, especially when you get as far north as France. And the expectation for all of the various nobles and even the king himself is that they're supposed to be self-sufficient in terms of funding and food from their own estates. Kings only later would be able to draw tax revenue. That would be one of the great reforms of the later French monarchies, is forming the centralized state. When a king was first chosen, he would then be elevated on the shields of warriors. This was a very old Germanic custom. It's also something that the Vikings like to do. And this is it's also something the Roman legions would do sometimes when they would elect an emperor. So fairly common practice, but we know for a fact that the Franks had it as well. Because of their distinctive long hair, the Merovingians are often called the long-haired kings. It's just a fun little fact. And I'm not going to go into any of the details lest this video become a marathon. But there are a lot of saints from the Merovingian era, and they're all over France. Like, all over the place you can find little shrines to saints. I'm sure there's like a calendar where there's probably one for every day. Who knows? There's a lot of them, though. I don't think the church in France is as interesting as the church in Spain. It was much less independent and followed much more in line with what Rome did than the Visigothic church did. It just occurred to me that I haven't really said much about the military forces that all of these successor kingdoms were using. Obviously, they fought a lot of wars, so they must have had some military power. Well, just like most of these people, the Frankish army was based around heavy infantry comparable to the late Roman army. The equipment and sometimes the tactics would have been fairly similar. They would have just been paid in a little bit differently, and they probably wouldn't have been quite as well disciplined. They also would have been more localized and more dependent on local nobles that would increase over time. The one sort of distinctive thing that the Franks have is their throwing axe called the Francisca, also called the Francesca. And while other people did use it, this was something that was normally seen as a Frankish innovation and something that they were the best at. This is something that they were using when they were still fighting Romans in the 5th century, and it's also something that Charlemagne was using even during his reign. So it's a weapon that had several variants and a long history. And under Charles Martel, one of his other innovations, other than centralizing the state and defeating Arab raiders and all that kind of stuff, he also helps to develop heavy cavalry, which are basically the prototypes for knights. The guys pictured on your screen there, those are kind of like, they're a few plates of armor and a lance away from being knights. I mean, they're moving in that direction, but they're not quite there. and that's one thing that's normally attributed to Charles Martel. By the way, Martel means the hammer. I forgot to mention that, but that's a very important factoid. Now you know. Anyhow, we're going to finish up 2 more lectures for this week, and then for the subsequent weeks, we're definitely going to have fewer because these things are taking forever.